So you were working on Carrie when you had first gotten the offer to to kind of pique your interest on Star Wars. When did you first meet George?
I met George after a screening of Phantom of the Paradise. There was a screening and an after party, and at the party, I was introduced to Marsha Lucas, and who's a great editor in her own right. And she said, "Oh, you're the editor? Come on, George wants to meet you." And she grabbed me by the hand and she pulled me through the crowd, and there's George, and he's you know his shirt hanging out of his pants and blue jeans and sneakers, and looked like somebody who snuck into the screening, but he's just an he looks, the interesting thing about George is he looks like an ordinary guy, but he's anything but an ordinary guy. He's the most extraordinary individual I've ever met, probably, and I've met quite a few extraordinary individuals. Um, but he seems to be he has two qualities that usually reside in different people. You either have a tremendous artistic imagination or you have a great business mind. And very rarely are they in the same person. And George is one of these people who has a terrific artistic vision and also a great business mind. So, yeah, we met at this party and he said, really like your work. I said, thank you. And that was that. And then about a year later, Marsha was working on Taxi Driver, and she called me up in New York and she said, "We need help on Taxi Driver. We need Marty shot so much footage. We need more help. Can you come?" And I said, "Sure." And she called the next day and she said, "I'm sorry, the studio won't permit it. They're not going to pay per diem for somebody from New York. There's enough editors in Hollywood, they claim." So I had to pass that up. And then um, when Brian was casting Carrie, George was casting Star Wars, and they were looking for actors the same age. So they would have their casting calls together, and actors would come in and read for the two of them. And the kid who played Tommy Ross in Carrie was hoping to get cast as Luke Skywalker, but he didn't get the part. But anyway, they were having their casting calls together, and during a break in one of these sessions, Brian called me up and put George on the phone, and he said, "I'm doing this picture Star Wars, and I already have an editor for it, but I'd like to work with you on the one after that." I said, "Great, that's terrific." And I went home and I said to my wife, I said, "It's nice that he wants to work with me, but this Star Wars thing sounds terrific." So yeah, and then Brian went off to shoot Carrie, George went off to shoot Star Wars, and he was in England and North Africa, and we got finished with Carrie, and George had finished principal photography on Star Wars, and he and Marsha were flying back to California from London, and they stopped in New York, and we screened a cut of Carrie for them, and then they liked it, and then they went off to California. And about 2 weeks later, I got another phone call from Marsha. She's saying, we need help on Star Wars because the original editor didn't work out, and there's just Richard Chu and I working on the picture, and we need an extra pair of hands. Are you available?" And I said, "Are you going to call tomorrow and say the studio wouldn't permit it?" And she said, "No, no, no. This is a completely different situation. George is in charge." And I said, "Okay, great. Yeah, I'd love to." So actually, I didn't. I said, it was actually when this conversation with Marsha came about right after we discovered that my wife was pregnant with our first child. So I said to her, "I just have to check with my wife." So I got off the phone and Brian heard this. He said, "What? You don't tell her that. Call her back." He calls her back. He says, "Marsha, he'll do it. How much? We're paying him this much. Can you pay him? Okay, fine." He hangs up. He says, "You don't give her, don't tell her your problems. Work it out. Just say yes and you work it out." So this was a very important lesson. All you young people out there, when you're up for a job, don't say anything that would give anyone an excuse not to hire you. Just say yes to everything. If you get the job, you can say no after that, but don't bring up problems before you get the job. That's what I learned. So anyway, they ignored that, and I went home and I said to my wife, I told her the story. She said, "Do it." So off I went, and our first
Yeah.
child was born in California as a result. Even though our home and my base was in New York, uh, my daughter was born in Marin General Hospital.
So I know there is absolutely no expectation that Star Wars would be the cultural powerhouse that it became, or I mean, even successful enough to break even. It kind of seems like the horse no one wanted to put their money on. But when you were in those early stages, looking at like principal photography, what was that impression that at least made you think that this project was unique and something special?
Well, George revived. I guess it was due to his going to film school and learning all sorts of techniques that I knew nothing about, but photographing models against a blue screen and shooting actors against blue screens and combining. This is the way special effects were done in those days. They would film different elements and rephotograph the negative using mats and combine all these different pieces of film into one piece of film. So you have the background and the foreground, and that existed in different places in real life, but through trick photography, you would blend them together. They hadn't invented CGI yet. So he was reviving these techniques that they had used, somewhat, but he refined them to a great. And of course, Kubrick had done the same thing in 2001. So George was sort of standing on his shoulders as well. All this stuff that they were doing, and then the lightsaber effects were extraordinary because in the original photography the saber seemed to glow, and I couldn't figure out how they had done that. And it was a very ingenious method of front projecting the light onto a mirror that the camera was shooting through, so that the light source that was cast onto the lightsabers was from the same point as the camera lens. So any shadows that it cast were invisible because they matched exactly the object that was casting the shadow behind them. So you wouldn't see any of the shadows. Anyway, they did some really, clever, sophisticated in-camera trickery, and yeah, and then he actually photographed the space aliens, which up to that point in Hollywood movies, they might have had some guy in a rubber suit, like the creature from the Black Lagoon or something. You'd have one weird creature per movie. You didn't have 50. You didn't have 50 robots, and I mean, the extravagance of the imagination that was on display was, yeah, I didn't make any predictions about how it would do, but I knew that I liked the movie a lot. As I was working on it, I thought this is really cool. And then Ben Burt was coming up with these extraordinary sounds, and um, yeah, I had the, we all had the feel. I don't know. We didn't have time to stop and think about what we were doing because we were working so hard and fast. So, but I think the general sense was that we were working on something pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, just like those early days of Industrial Light and Magic, and you actually got a chance to go to the shop and see these models, see these blue screens. I mean, it was just a testament to just the amount of creativity that they had, in that effects studio, and I mean, also gives credit to George too by knowing the right kinds of people to hire. But in the book that you
Not only that, but an extraordinarily courageous to choose this and stick to his guns all the way through for this multi-year process to see his vision accomplished, even though hardly anyone sort of understood. I mean, I got the script and it said the Wookiee and the X-wings and the Y-wings and the droids, and I didn't know what I was supposed to imagine, but I don't think anyone really knew except George. He understood the world he was creating, and the stick to itiveness and the devotion to that vision, and the courage to see it all the way through are really extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, primarily, that first movie, if you haven't seen Star Wars before, the first time that you watch it, you just get the sense that this is a lived in world. There's so many little attentions to detail and so many little subtleties of, the set design, just how they, had different types of buildings, different types of sets. It makes it seem so much more flushed out, and it makes it seem so much more real by doing that. And it just shows, the great imagination that George had, and how much time he had put of his life into this. Even in his youth, kind of focusing on this tale he wanted to tell.
And
But in the
one
book, you
of the
discuss
things,
that. Uh,
one of the things he insisted on in the set dressing was he wanted everything to look used. He wanted
yeah.
everything to be distressed, like and even 3PO has one silver leg. He's made up of spare parts. Nothing is brand new. Nothing is the in George's mind, the science fiction movies, everything was always sparkling clean and unused and spotless, and he wanted everything to be dirty. And he would, go on the set. He'd throw, uh, oil onto the snow in Hoth. He would spatter oil around. Just he just wanted everything to look dirty and lived in and real.
Yeah, well, I mean, but also how he uses that is such a great juxtaposition, because, the rebels and, the heroes, I guess, where they come from, it's always dirty, everything's used. However, the empire is very clean and shining, and it kind of, adds that subtext of, the economic disparity between the rebellion and the empire. And I mean, it's just little attentions to detail like that that really just make the meaning or the subtext of the film a little bit more profound.
Uh-huh.
Now, in your book, you actually discuss that when you were working with De Palma, he was a lot more direct and vocal about how he wanted secrets or sequences to go, but George was a lot more soft spoken. So, as a creative type yourself, how did this kind of help or hinder your creative process?
Well, George was very busy. I mean, he was splitting his time between the cutting room and ILM, and ILM was in LA, cutting room was up north. So um, on Monday morning, he'd fly down to LA and spend Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday with the guys at ILM. And then Wednesday night, he'd fly back. He'd come in Thursday morning, spend Thursday, Friday, and Saturday in the editing room with us. And there were three editors working. He had to look at the work of three editors, um, and uh, and then he took Sunday off and started all over again. So he didn't really have time for a lot of. Uh, None of the editors really got a whole lot of time with him. Uh, Although we did have, on occasion, we had some really memorable conversations, which I describe in the book, where he talked about his principles and how he things that he lived by in filmmaking, things that he had learned, and it was fascinating to me because I didn't go to film school. I didn't know anyone ever thought about this stuff. I thought that uh, movies were kind of everything was improvised because I was improvising and Brian was sort of improvising um, but yeah, it was fascinating times. A long time ago now, Jimmy.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna try and have you remember back a little bit, because, I mean, with the time that you did share with George, I mean, he's such an imaginative person, and I mean, kind of like a larger than life figure, by today's standards. But is there any? I mean, how would you describe, based off the interactions and conversations that you had, how would you describe his creative process?
I couldn't begin to tell you. I mean, I think he worked uh, primarily. It starts with the writing. Coppola, who was his mentor at the outset, told him that you'll never get anywhere in the film business if you can't write. So he took this to heart, and he took his student film THX and expanded it into a feature film, and then he did Graffiti, which is based on his high school experiences, which he wrote with Willard Hike and Gloria Katz. And um, but I guess Star Wars, I don't know. I don't know where it came from. It's sort of THX-ish, but THX is more of an experimental film without much story to it. It's just sort of atmosphere and production design, and um, the story and characters aren't salient as and prominent as they are in Star Wars. We have real archetypal characters, Obi-Wan and the princess and Han, and I can't really describe his creative process to you because so much of it is done outside my presence.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess, with, well, I guess, when approaching a project, that has so many different influences, whether it be, religious, cultural, samurai movies. I mean, there's so much going on in Star Wars. How did you kind of have to adapt your creative process around that?
Well, my process was simply, to play what's wrong with this picture. I would look at the scene and I would think, what's wrong here? And then, oh, well, this shot is going on way too long. We've got to cut out of this sooner. And this shot is the cut out of it is abrupt, and I got to smooth that out. And this seems to be in the wrong place, or this taking too long, or I mean, so when you're editing something, you're constantly playing this game of what's wrong with this picture, and you try to identify the things that are wrong with it, and you keep looking at it until you can't find any more things wrong with it, and that's when it's ready to show to George. So his mandate on each scene was fix it. He wouldn't say, this, that, or the other thing. He would say, it's not working, fix it. And me, my job to diagnose the problems and fix them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, also, with just like, I don't know, there's so many sequences. I mean, going back to Carrie and, those ambitious scenes, there's a lot of ambitious scenes in Star Wars. And primarily, we'll just focus on probably the most ambitious, which is that final battle scene. And by now it's one of the most iconic end battles in film history. I mean, the
Yeah,
build up to Luke's trench run
yeah.
uses action in a way that builds tension, gets the audience engaged. I mean, I've seen Star Wars over 100 times. I watch it at least once a year, but when I watch it, it still draws me in and gets me emotionally invested. So the battle leading up to that trench run, how
Yeah.
did you approach editing this scene, and what did you want to bring to make it as memorable, or what did you bring to make it as memorable as it is?
Well, it's very, very easy for me because I didn't cut it. It was Marsha who cut it.
Really, really? So I thought you had some additional
Well,
cuts going into it.
what happened was when I got to San Anselmo, Marsha was building the end battle. She was still piecing it together, and Richard was recutting the reels. So I joined Richard in recutting the reels.
Okay.
We were playing "What's Wrong with This Picture" with the rest of the movie, and uh, if he was working on reel two, I'd go to reel three, and then he'd finish two and go on to four, and so we were sort of leapfrogging our way through the reels while she was still putting together the end battle, and she was working with shots of the pilots sitting on um, cockpit sets made out of wood, you know, and with blue screens behind them. And um, then they had Princess Leia and all her, all the rebels back in the command center, wherever that was. And so those were the elements. And then she had these, the exteriors were represented by World War II fighter plane footage. So she was wrestling this into some kind of shape for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then finally, it got to a point where ILM had to have the sequence. And George pulled me off what I was doing. And he said, we're going to break this end battle into two parts. Uh, Marsha's going to work on the part up to Luke's trench run, and you're going to take it from that point on. So we did that. She worked on the first, it was more than half, and I worked on the final bit, and and then we combined them, and the three of us, George, Marsha, and I, worked together on locking the final version of the whole thing.
Now, let me ask you,
Yeah,
I personally, I think like I mean, leading up to that trench run, one of the best scenes. I mean, it's a scene that just actually, and I remember it vividly as a child. It actually got me. Mind you, I'm like 3 or 4 at this point, so pretty much any sort of like loud noise and motion is gonna get me excited. But that one little quick cut that you added in there with Han Solo just racing towards it with that little Yahoo moment, like, I think that is the little cherry on top that makes that whole sequence run because it's building up to that one point and you see the redemption of, I mean, pretty much everybody's favorite character.
yeah. Well, it's funny you should mention that shot because we didn't have that shot till very late in the day, and Marcia had in December of that year had gone off to work with Scorsese on New York, New York, and uh, we had that sequence, that shot you're talking about, is in the part of the end battle that I cut, which is the last, Luke's trench run. And for the longest time, we had a piece of blank leader representing that shot. It was to length, but there was no image. It was just a sort of a scribble on it that sort of danced, and and we knew that that dancing scribble stood in for the shot of the Millennium Falcon coming toward camera with the sun behind. And Marsha kept saying, if that shot doesn't work, then the whole movie is not going to work. And I kept saying, don't worry, it's going to work. I'm sure it's going to work. And she went off to work with Scorsese, and we had a preview. She came back, and at that moment in the screening, when we cut to that shot, the audience stood up and cheered, literally stood up and cheered. And I glanced over at her, and she saw me, and she said, "I guess it works." So it's funny that you should pick that moment, but yeah, it was. Yeah, it was exciting then and exciting now.